Well, hey, everybody. I am not Ken Sermons. I'm Zach. I'm the worship pastor here. If it's your first time, you picked a great Sunday to come, because if this tanks, then I can say, well, just wait until next week. I'm not the regular guy. And if it goes really well, I can say, well, you should hear a regular guy. So it's great to be able to do this. I just want to pose a question for you. If you could meet anyone in history, present or past, who would it be? I mean, for some people, they immediately think of maybe a lost loved one they'd love to see again. The brown nosers in the room would obviously say Jesus. Okay, we get it. You want to see Jesus. We all want to see Jesus. Okay, play the game right. Okay. Some people would think of a celebrity. People pay mega bucks for that kind of thing, don't they? They pay for the backstage pass or the meet and greet just for 5 seconds to be able to talk to that person face to face, have a brief conversation. They'll pay extra for that, hundreds of dollars sometimes extra for that. For me, I'm a huge baseball fan. If we haven't met before and haven't had more than a 5-minute conversation, okay, I love baseball. It's like the only professional sport that I follow. I grew up watching baseball with my dad. I played baseball up through college. It's my favorite sport. So the person that I'd like to meet is probably someone baseball related. Okay, when Nicole and I were dating, she told me that she liked baseball too, and she kind of does. But she was from Jacksonville, Florida, and baseball was only televised like once a week. So when we got married and she found out that there are 162 games in the season and I will be watching all of them, that got uncomfortable a little bit, okay? I think if I had to pick one, it would probably be Ted Williams. If you're not into baseball at all, Ted Williams played back in the 50s. He played for the Boston Red Sox. He's the last player to make it an entire season and bat 400. So if you don't know what that means, just take my word for it. That's really, really good, okay? He played for over 10 seasons and only had one season where he batted less than 300, which is also pretty unheard of, okay? Ted Williams, in fact, the last season of his contract was the last season that he played was in 1960. The Boston Red Sox offered him a contract for 1 year to pay him $60,000. If you adjust that for inflation, that's only $516,000. Now, if you're talking Major League Baseball, that's less than the league minimum right now by about $250,000. And because the year prior to that, he batted .254 for the year, which, by the way, is also still pretty good. Austin Riley batted .256 last year, and he's our number 3 guy, okay? Since Ted Williams only batted .254, he went to the GM of the Red Sox at the time and demanded a 30% pay decrease before he would sign on to the contract. Is that not amazing? I mean, that would never happen today. So to me, I just think that's an amazing thing about him, apart from the lore that supposedly his head and his body are cryogenically frozen somewhere in hopes of reviving him. That part's not true, but I just think that it's really interesting to meet a guy who would say, no, I'm disappointed in the way that I performed last year. I think I would like a pay decrease before I go on. I've only actually ever met one famous person personally. I used to cater barbecue some as a side hustle for a while, and I was out in the Sandy Springs area doing some barbecue catering for a nonprofit, and I got it all set up. I'm there cutting up brisket and focused. And I just kind of look up, and Terry Pendleton is handing out his plate to me to put some brisket on there. I'm like, whoa! So we have a brief conversation there. He's a super nice guy. It was great to meet him. I remember when I was a kid, my family was out shopping one time. We were in Alpharetta at North Point Mall because in the mid-'90s, the Mall of Georgia was not built yet. And if you're a kid from Cumming, then you go to Alpharetta and you shop at North Point Mall. And because my mom was with us, we were at Kirkland's. I hate Kirkland's, okay? I hated it as a boy. I hate it as an adult. I don't like going in there, okay? They pump that potpourri so strong in there, it burns your sinuses, okay? There's so much stuff, you can barely walk around. My mom loves the place. I hate the place. And so I'm a kid, and I'm just trying not to touch anything, because if I do, the wrath of mom is coming. And suddenly, Tom Glavine and his wife walk into the store. Okay? And I remember this because, I'm a kid, I don't really know who that is. I kind of recognize him, but my dad is kind of giddy about it. And he's like nudging me, and he's found like a blown glass ornament baseball that he's trying to get me to go ask Tom Glavine to sign. And I'm a kid, I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. And I wish that I had, but I wouldn't do it then. Had these close encounters with people, but the chance meetings with celebrities seldom have the effect that we think that they're going to, don't they? It's usually the more ordinary people in our life that have the biggest effect. For me, that would be Mrs. Touchton. I have a picture of her. I think Mrs. Touchton was, or maybe not, Mrs. Touchton was my 6th grade world history teacher, okay? Up until that point, I didn't care about history. It was just facts I was having to memorize. I thought, why do I have to learn about this? Why do I have to know these things? It doesn't matter. It didn't involve me. But Miss Touchton found a way. To this day, I'm not really sure how, but the way that she taught, she was able to convince me that people who lived in ancient Egypt or ancient China had stories that would be interesting to me. And from that point on, I have always loved history for some reason. She's the first one who was able to do that for me. I didn't choose her as my 6th grade teacher. It was just a chance encounter that she had that impact on my life. And obviously, there's been tons of those throughout history, countless chance encounters throughout history that had a massive impact on the future. In 1905, there was a 16-year-old boy who dreamed of being an artist and an architect. So he applied twice to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, but the examiners rejected him because of his poor test drawings. Now, the second time that he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, the dean actually thought, you might have a future in architecture. Like, these are pretty good, but the school had a rule that you could not be admitted if you didn't have a high school diploma, and the dean refused to relax that rule, and so the boy didn't make it in. This single encounter would change the fate of generations. You know what his name was? Do you know who that 16-year-old boy was? It was Adolf Hitler. He should have just let the boy draw. Now, before FDR became the longest-serving president in U.S. history, when he was 39 years old in 1921, he was on a holiday at the lake with his family, suddenly started to develop severe leg pains. He contacted his family doctor, and it just so happened that there was a celebrated surgeon who was also vacationing at the same lake nearby, and so FDR's family doctor said, hey, since this guy is already in the area, you should consult him about your leg pain. So FDR goes to the doctor examines him, and having never heard of someone so old coming down with polio, because it was primarily a disease of the young, of children, he misdiagnoses FDR as having a spinal lesion and prescribes vigorous massaging of his legs. The absolute worst treatment you can give someone with polio. In 80% of cases of polio, the person recovers. This surgeon massively changed those odds for FDR, effectively confining him to a wheelchair for the rest of his life as he becomes paralyzed from the waist down. Just one chance encounter changed it all. And not just for him. As the U.S. president throughout World War II, his frailties increased as the war was coming to an end. And for the last year of the war, when crucial political confrontations with the Soviet Union set the course for post-war territorial settlements, many historians see FDR's failing health as a crucial factor in the weakening of U.S. resilience against Stalin over the fate of the fascist empires. That by the time they have the Yalta Conference, where the U.S. and the U.K. and the Soviet Union meet in order to discuss the reestablishment of war-torn Europe, it's in shambles, and they got to figure out what to do. By that time, it's universally agreed upon by historians that Stalin came out on top of the negotiations because of FDR's frailty at the time. 2 weeks after the Yalta Conference, FDR would lose his life. He was only 63 years old. All because at the lake he got a massage. There's an encounter in the Bible that we're going to discuss today, have a look at. If you want to turn to Mark chapter 15, I'm going to be completely honest, it's a tough one. The reason that it's so tough is because there is little to no information about the character that we're going to be studying today. Last week, we started this series where we're looking at different peripheral characters in the crucifixion story. Ken talked about Barabbas. Barabbas was a notorious criminal and insurrectionist who was freed instead of Jesus. The crowd chose Barabbas and granted him freedom over Jesus. Pilate then, as governor, washes his hands in front of the people and he says, "I'm innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Apparently it didn't take much for Pilate to clear his conscience. So all he's got to do is say, "It's not my problem." They would strip him of his clothing. They would put a different robe on him. Then they pressed this makeshift crown upon his head. They mocked him. They beat him. They spit on him. They snatched the robe back off of him before leading to his imminent death. Mark writes in chapter 15, verse 20, he says, "When they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him." Verse 21, here's the chance encounter that I mentioned. "And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull." This is also mentioned in Matthew and in Luke. In Matthew 27, verse 32, it says, "As they went out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. They compelled this man to carry his cross." Luke 23:26 says, "And as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene who was coming in from the country and laid on him the cross to carry behind Jesus." John doesn't mention Simon at all. Now, I love learning. I love researching. People ask me all the time, "How do you know how to do so much stuff?" And it's really not because I'm super talented or anything like that. I just love figuring things out. If I encounter a problem, I want to learn as much as I can about it. If there's a subject that strikes interest to me, I'm not just going to watch a documentary and be done with it. I'm going to find out everything I can about it. My wife will tell you I hyperfixate on that subject, and I will study and study and study until I am finally satisfied that I know everything there is to know about this thing, and then I will find something else to hyperfixate on and learn that thing. So when I read something like this and I see Simon gets one sentence in 3 of the 4 Gospels, my mind just starts reeling, and I'm like, okay, I start asking all kinds of questions. What do I know? I know his name, I know where he's from, I know where he's coming from, and I know what he does. What else can I find out about Simon? And the truth is that there is no other reliable documentation of Simon's life prior to his encounter with Jesus, and nothing after. This encounter is his life's defining moment. Now, if we're to figure out what we can get from these verses, I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about how the Gospels were written. If you're anything like me, for some reason, I grew up thinking a couple different things about the Gospels. One is that I thought Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all disciples. Okay, they would be like the first four that I named. If you asked me to name all 12 disciples, I'd say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Turns out only two of them were disciples. Only Matthew and John were disciples. And Mark and Luke actually never even met Jesus, y'all. Like, all you got to do is read the New Testament and you figure that out. The reason that they write about them is because Mark was good friends with Peter, who was a eyewitness to Jesus, and Luke was good friends with Paul, who had a revelation of Jesus on the road to Damascus and learned the gospel that way. The second thing that I thought, for some reason, I have no idea where I got this, was that when they were writing the Gospels, that they went into some kind of fugue state and like were entranced, and God just took over their body and wrote down like every single word for word, what he wanted them to write. I don't know where I got that from. Okay, that's nuts. Okay, that's not how it was written. Okay, the Bible is inspired by God, but it is written by people. So the gospel writers, they get inspired by the Holy Spirit to make an account of Jesus' life, but then they have to do the hard work of interviewing eyewitnesses, getting sources, figuring out what Jesus did, what he said, and then they compile it into what we have today. These writers, they were simultaneously inspired by God, and yet they were written by people, and they take specific things, specific order, they put things in a specific order with specific details to give us a specific message. Mark, for instance, was probably the first one to write his gospel. There's reasons. There's a bunch of reasons for that. I've already proved to you that I'm a huge history nerd, okay, so I'm not going to bore you with all those details. But just suffice to say, Mark was probably first. Mark was one of those I mentioned, has never met Jesus, but the book of Acts and several other epistles note that Mark had a close relationship with Peter, who was a disciple and eyewitness to Jesus' ministry. And so that's why we assume that Mark relied heavily on Peter's testimony as he wrote the gospel. Most scholars, much smarter than me, conclude that since similar stories are accounted for in Matthew and Luke, that they used Mark's gospel as one of their references, okay? So Mark was first. Matthew and Luke both use a little bit of Mark to get some of their information. They also have their own sources that they pull from. There's some things that Matthew and Luke have in common together that's not in Mark. And so that's where some scholars agree that there's even a third source. So we have they have Mark's account. There's things that Matthew writes about that are just his, things that Luke writes about that are just his, things that Matthew and Luke write about that is this third source. John does his own thing. Like, he's just the wild card in all this, okay? He has his own sources. We can just leave that right there. Okay, he's kind of the outsider right here. So the reason I'm telling you this is not just because I like history, although I do. It's because I want you to understand that when the gospel writers put Jesus' stories and teachings to paper, they put them in a specific order and included specific details to tell us, the reader, a specific message. Okay, this will help you in your Bible study instead of being fixated on trying to make sure that everything lines up exactly right, to know it's inspired by God, but it's written by people, and they had something they wanted to communicate by the order in which they put Jesus' actions in. So you can remember it like this: specific order plus specific details equals specific message. For example, Mark is the only one who tells us that Simon had sons. It was an important detail to him. It wasn't that important to Matthew or Luke, or they would have included it, right? So how come? He says, the soldiers compelled a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus. He mentions them as if the reader already knows who they are. I mean, what other reason would he have for putting them in there? We don't learn of Alexander and Rufus otherwise. He puts them in there assuming that the reader is going to be familiar enough with them. Now, Mark is writing to the Romans, to a Roman audience. Why else would he mention this unless they knew those boys? It's as if he was saying, listen, I know this sounds crazy that someone got to carry Jesus' cross, but it's true, I'm telling you. Just ask Alexander and Rufus. So some things are different. Some things are the same. There's three details that all three accounts have in common. The first, y'all, is that Simon was a foreigner. Simon was an immigrant. We don't know if he was Jewish or otherwise. We do know he was African. Cyrene was a port city in North Africa in what is now modern-day Libya. Okay, to get there at Passover, he would have had to travel 800 miles. If you can imagine starting in Atlanta, Georgia, on camel, horse, foot, whatever, and you go all the way to New York City, and then 50 more miles. That's how far he had to go to get to Jerusalem for Passover. And all three of the accounts mention this fact, that he was from Cyrene, which is unique because when other times in the Gospels when people are described, it's normally by like who their dad was or what their occupation was or what group they were affiliated with, such as like Simon the Zealot, Matthew the tax collector, okay? We talked about Barabbas last week, that the word bar means son of. So to have this situation where all three gospel writers say it's Simon of Cyrene, they want you to know he was not from Jerusalem. He was a foreigner. It's like they're all saying in sync with one another. In the final hour of Jesus' life on earth, he was served by a foreigner. I'll just let that sink in for a minute. Now, the second thing that they all have in common was that he was chosen suddenly and randomly. Mark and Luke say Simon was coming into the city from the countryside as the crowd was going out. Matthew says that they met as they went out, which is slightly less descriptive, but it's the same general idea. Okay, he wasn't inside the city. He wasn't originally part of the crowd that asked for Jesus' crucifixion. He wasn't part of the governor's guards. He wasn't part of the Roman officials either. Okay, he was minding his own business, coming in from the countryside as the Romans were leading Jesus out of the gate of Jerusalem, and he was chosen. He was compelled. That is to say, he was forced to carry the cross of Jesus. Why? Now, we're not told specifically why, but we could figure it out. I mean, what other reason would they make somebody else carry Jesus' cross? I mean, it had to be because he was beaten, he was stripped, he was starved. He clearly didn't have the strength to carry his own cross to his crucifixion. Okay, he wouldn't have carried the entire cross. He would carried the cross beam, actually, which weighed approximately 90 pounds. And so by the time Jesus reaches this point, I mean, he's near death. He's about to expire. The Roman officials see this, and they're like, okay, but we've got a job to do, and if he dies here, that's not going to be good for us. We got to get there. So you help. Simon is forced. He's headed one direction and is forced to turn around and head the other direction. So the last thing that we know about Simon is that Simon carried the cross of Jesus. Luke's account is interesting, though. Remember, I told you that the gospel writers put the story of Jesus in a specific order with specific details to teach us a specific message. Well, Luke does something that's pretty unique, okay? In literary analysis, you would call this a two-beat. Let me show you what I mean. After the Passover meal, we call it the Lord's Supper, okay? Jesus warns Peter of his denial. Jesus takes his disciples into the Mount of Olives to pray. This is the Garden of Gethsemane. You're probably familiar with that term, Garden of Gethsemane. He tells the disciples, pray that you might not enter into temptation. Well, they don't. They fall asleep. And Jesus prays this in Luke chapter 22, verse 22 through 43. He says, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. Okay, Luke includes this detail, and none of the others do. That God sent an angel to help him in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, the writer of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, he says, in the days of his flesh, he's actually referencing this prayer right here. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Jesus prayed that God would save him from death. And the writer of Hebrews says he was heard. Well, y'all know as well as I do what happened. Y'all, he died. He was dead. And the writer of Hebrews says that he was heard. He prayed to God and was heard. Now, I don't think we're talking semantics here. I don't think we can say, well, he just said heard. He didn't say that he answered him. Okay, whatever. The tone that the writer of Hebrews is using, he says, Jesus cried out with cries and tears to him who was able to save him, and he was heard. But we know he died. So how can we say that Jesus' prayer was heard? Death loomed in front of Jesus. He knew it was coming. He knew he had to die, but he was also human. Death has a way of tearing down our faith in a hurry. I mean, just ask anybody who had a loved one that got sick and you prayed for years for them to get better, but they didn't. That's faith shaking right there. I mean, you don't even have to get that serious about it. You could reference a TV show when somebody's being interrogated and everything's fine. They're not telling anybody anything. But then as soon as their life is threatened, they're like, okay, I'll tell you everything, right? They spill the beans because death has a way of taking us to that point. Even for Jesus, death was so horrible that it tempted him to turn from his purpose, and he begged God, don't let death destroy me like that, please. And God sent an angel to help him. He wasn't praying that he wouldn't die. He prayed that the horrors of suffering and death wouldn't hinder his obedience. And so here's what I mean by to be, okay? Jesus needed spiritual help in the garden, and God sent an angel. He needed physical help on the way to the cross, and he sent Simon. Two situations where Jesus needed both of these things, and Luke wants you to bring your attention to that. He wants to show you that. Let me show you one more thing. Ooh, I'm sorry. I'm not used to this fancy, like, Garth Brooks microphone. Matthew and Mark both say that Simon carried the cross, but Luke says that they laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. He was the only writer to specifically say that Simon carried the cross behind Jesus. Now, why is that important? Okay, it could be coincidence. I will honestly admit that. But I don't think it is. I think Luke is probably a genius and put this in here on purpose to perk our ears up. Luke quotes Jesus earlier in his gospel in chapter 9, verse 23, and he says, if anyone would come after me, or literally there, if anyone would come behind me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Luke uses the same preposition in chapter 9, verse 23, saying if anyone would come after him to follow him, he says get behind him, as he does whenever he's describing Simon carrying the cross behind Jesus. I believe that Luke is suggesting to us that Simon is a picture of what true discipleship really is. So picture it, okay? Simon was passing by. He's coming in from the countryside. He was on the outside coming in while Jesus was on the inside being forced out. Two men were traveling in opposite directions that day, Simon coming in, Jesus going out, when suddenly Simon finds himself turned completely around at the demand of a Roman soldier. And imagine how it would feel. Guys, place yourself in his footsteps. Imagine how it would feel to literally follow in the footsteps of Jesus that day. A 90-pound bloodied beam hoisted up on your shoulders. You've got to carry it. I've done the math. I looked at the map. Okay, you've got to carry it at least 3/4 of a mile. And that's as the crow flies, okay? That's a straight shot. More than likely, these Roman soldiers are going to parade you around for a little while. So you're carrying a 90-pound beam, which, I mean, I get tired carrying around my 50-pound 7-year-old for more than 10 minutes. A 90-pound beam for 3/4 of a mile, maybe a mile, I'll wear you out. An angry mob is close behind, screaming curses at the person who's in front of you. Mixed in with the angry mob is the wailing of his devastated friends. And while you struggle to find the right grip on that beam, can you imagine Jesus turning around and giving you a sympathetic glance? And as you hear the cries of his supporters, even then, Jesus' attention isn't on himself. In that moment, he turns and he says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed." Guys, this was a big deal because in the Old Testament, it is constantly kids are constantly referred to as a blessing from God. And Jesus is saying, soon enough, it's going to be so bad that you're going to look at people and say, you've never had kids? Good for you. Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it's dry? All of this is a reference to the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, in a nutshell, what happens 40 years after Jesus is crucified is that the Jews finally get tired of the Roman rule and they decide to form a revolt. They stand up to the big guy, okay? They're going to try and take him down, but it doesn't work. All they do is poke the bear, and what happens is everyone in Jerusalem is either killed or taken prisoner and hauled off elsewhere. It doesn't work. And so even in the final moments of Jesus' life, he isn't grieved over his own circumstances. He's grieved over the fate of the people that he loves, and they have no idea what's coming. You finally reach a place called the skull. Ominous name. You're exhausted. You drop the beam onto the ground. You're too tired to go anywhere. And even if you weren't, you're not from here. So you're not sure where to go. So, yeah, you'll be sticking around to see what happens, I guess. The man you've been following the whole time is laid down onto the beam, and nails are pounded into his palms onto the same beam that you just carried for a mile. You hear taunting. You see soldiers rip off Jesus' clothes. Someone offers him sour wine, saying, hey, if you're king of the Jews, why don't you save yourself? One of the criminals that's crucified alongside Jesus joins in the taunts, says the same thing, before all three of them are finally hoisted up into the air. And despite the beatings, despite the accusations, despite the ridicule, you hear Jesus' voice like sandpaper, barely above a whisper, saying, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. This is the scene that Luke uses to illustrate Jesus' words, if anyone would come after me, let him take up his cross and follow me. He wants to say, when you read the words, or hear the words, take up your cross and follow me, I want this image burned into your mind. Because there's only one reason why somebody would pick up a cross, y'all. There's only one reason. Crucifixion. This is the ultimate lesson of Simon of Cyrene. Now, our natural inclination is to live opposition-free, right? Shame-free, suffering-free, death-free. Thank you very much. Not for me. But once that cross goes on your back, the old self is headed one place only. Our new self begins to fix its gaze on Jesus. And we say, more than freedom from opposition, I want Jesus. More than freedom from shame, I want Jesus. More than freedom from suffering, I want Jesus. More than freedom from death itself, I want Jesus. The new self seeks life by following Jesus. The old life sought life by escaping from Jesus. It is bewildering to me that so many people believe that you can be a follower of Jesus Christ without actually following him. It is commonplace today to think, all I got to do is just receive Jesus. I'll pray a prayer. He'll keep me from hell. He'll bless my family. I'm just going to do my same old thing, live my same old life, do what makes me happy. But now Jesus is with me in life. Isn't that great? Y'all, that is not the message of the Bible. That is not the message of the cross. Jesus is saying, I have a better way of living, but you have to pick up the cross. Simon didn't want to pick up the cross, okay? He was forced to. He didn't want to. And the truth is, neither do we, if we're just being honest about that. We can build ourselves up with money, with wealth, with savings, with success, with fitness, with companionship. We can build ourselves up with significance, with all manner of activities, but that's not the way of Jesus. If Jesus is who we believe he is, me first living should be convicting. Okay? Not only that, it should be downright embarrassing. It's allowing our fear and our appetite, it's allowing all of our what ifs to be lord over us, okay? They're ruling over you. So why is it so difficult for us to get this? The disciples, turns out they were just as dumb as us. Okay, right after the Last Supper, where Jesus tells his disciples he's about to die, in Luke chapter 22, verse 24, it says, a dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors, but not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? But I am coming to you as one who serves. Jesus just got done telling them that he was about to go die on the cross, that it was his purpose. And the disciples are like, okay, but which one of us is your favorite? I'm like, what? That's something that my 5-year-old would say. If picking up your cross means carrying around some trinket, hoping that it'll bless your pursuit of happiness, or your pursuit of wealth, or your pursuit of love, or your pursuit of significance or success, then your desires are Lord of you, not Jesus. Luke says, look at Simon and let this image burn itself into your consciousness, because this is what it looks like to take up a cross. wealth cannot be king. My ambitions cannot be king. My comforts and my significance cannot be king. Folks, if you believe what you say you believe, you already have a king. You already have a king. Let's pray. God, it's too easy to put ourselves first. It's constantly modeled for us in every angle. We want to get more. We want to save more. We want to be more successful. We want to get approval. We want to be more secure, more. But the truth is that it is never enough. So why hold on? Help us to identify the areas of our life that need crucifying. When we find ourselves crossing paths with Jesus heading in the opposite direction, God, give us the grace to turn around. Keep us from continuing on in our own direction. Compel us to turn and pick up our cross and follow Jesus, walking in his steps, repeating his words, loving the things that he loves, hating the things that he hates. Show us the areas of our lives that don't match up with your heart. Let us consider it all as loss compared to knowing you. You came to us as one who serves, so may we do the same. Help us to love our neighbor. Guard us against the me first mentality. You're more than just a trinket we carry around to bless our doings. You are life itself, and your way is better. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Y'all stand and worship.